When sharks bite a human being, their typical behavior is to bite and then release. This is often because they realize that humans aren't their usual prey. However, when sharks are driven by hunger, aggression, and have a high level of predatory intent, it can result in some brutal and catastrophic attacks. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times a shark has bitten someone completely in half. Welcome to Final Affliction. March 22, 2014 in South Africa dawned bright and warm. Summer had just winded down the month before, and even though it was technically already autumn, that year the heat hung around long enough for just a little while longer. The Austrian group of tourists that landed down had chosen this time specifically. Early autumn is still warm enough to enjoy the beaches, but not so blisteringly hot that their light European skin would suffer in the African sun. Right on the very tip of the country, bordering the Indian Ocean, lies the small holiday town of Port St. John's. The Indian Ocean is much warmer than the sometimes freezing Atlantic Ocean that lies on the other side of the country. And as you can imagine, it's along this coastline where most of the swimming, surfing, and snorkeling happens. The beaches are almost always packed, unless it's in the dead of winter. And even then, there are always a handful of die-hard surfers still willing to go out into the waves. As popular a destination as Port St. John's is, it's not very well patrolled. The reality is that, of all of South Africa's nearly 3,000-mile coastline, every single inch of it is swarming with deadly sharks. Places like Jeffreys Bay, the Durban beaches, and Hartenbos are just busier and require the most attention. Port St. John's is not exactly on most tour groups' lists of hotspots. It's mostly frequented by locals, so it doesn't get as much traffic as the rest. You won't see any lifeguards here, and patrol vessels are at a minimum. Only the shark warning signs that dot the beach gives any indication that there might be any danger here. But in fact, it's one of the country's busiest breeding grounds for the colossal man-eating bull sharks. Had this group of Austrians, mostly made up of retirees, known this, maybe they'd have sought out another beach to cool off in. They only came to visit the iconic African safaris, the easy mountain trails, and they wanted to try out the local cuisine. But as soon as they landed, all of them decided that it was a good idea to find some water before heading inland to see the wild animals. Even along the coast, and in autumn no less, the heat was getting to them all. Frederick Bergstaller and his wife Margit practically threw themselves at the water when they arrived. The rest of the group were a little hesitant to get in themselves, not for fear of any danger. Instead, they found the packed beach a little claustrophobic. At 66, Frederick was still an excellent swimmer. He just needed to get past the first few shallow waves, and he'd be out of the crowd, where he could stretch out his arms and swim in the ocean that was virtually empty after those first few yards. Margit was content to roll up her pant legs and wade in the surf up to her ankles and watch her husband weave through the dozens of youngsters and families who were having an absolute ball, splashing and playing. All of the feet treading through the water was kicking up so much sand that there was virtually no visibility. The water just looked mucky and brown from above. But even if someone had been sharp enough to see a hint of the gray body that was stalking the swimmers from below, the noise of the beach would have dampened any shouts of warning. The animal had been moving just out of reach, hoping to hone in on one person in particular. But the mass of moving limbs was confusing. Every time it decided on a target, the whole mass of people's patterns shifted, and it had to start hunting all over again. That's until Frederick stepped into the water. Just as he got in up to his waist, he turned around to wave at Margit. Those few seconds he spent to stand still was enough for the shark to focus on him, and his stark white skin didn't help the situation much. Among the bodies and the shades of brown and black around him, Frederick stood out like a beacon in the murky water. It's almost no surprise that he was the one that the predator finally got a lock on. Poor Frederick was doomed the moment he set foot in the water. Frederick turned back to face the open sea, getting ready to dive headfirst in to catch some speed to swim out even farther, when the beast reared out of the dark. Frederick stumbled back, but it was too late, and the shark was too close. It grabbed him by both of his legs and lifted the man clear out of the water. It was like an explosion. One moment all was well, and the next there was absolute chaos when the animal and man burst out of the water, scattering the crowd instantly. Flecks of red and blue showered the people as they ran and shoved each other out of the way. The sudden uproar of stamping feet, splashes, and panicked screams were so deafening that it drowned out Frederick's own screams of fear and pain. The upsurge of chaos was so bewildering that the shark's jaws slacked for just a moment. That was all Frederick needed to rip himself free. Pushing with his hands against the animal's snout, he could feel the razor-sharp teeth tear through his skin as he pulled himself loose. In the instant that Frederick was free, he turned and began to run on his torn and shredded legs, but his limbs just couldn't hold him up after the beating that they just took. Frederick went down before he even took 2 steps in the direction of the retreating crowd. The beast was on him again. Horrified, Margit and the crowd saw Frederick pull back to throw a punch. He would have hit the approaching 2-meter-long monster square in the nose, but almost like it had been anticipating this very reaction, the shark opened his mouth just as Frederick's fist shot forward. His arm sank into the deep and dark gullet right up to his shoulder. And yes, the shark bit down, taking the entire right arm clean off the socket. Lifting his only remaining arm, Frederick attempted one last time to land a punch, but with legs that didn't work and a spewing hole where his right arm used to be, he simply sank beneath the surface with a final spray of blood that was swallowed by the water. Huddled on the sands, the crowd huddled in terror, no one daring to go into the vicious splashing that was happening just yards from them. Helpless, they were forced to watch as the shark fed on Frederick right in front of their eyes. Margit, hysterical, attempted to run into the surf, but 2 South African teenagers stopped her from running to her death. She struggled so fiercely that one of the boys, a 19-year-old, had to push her into the sand and sit on top of her to keep her out of the water. He begged for her to stop, while the other boy grabbed her hand, promising to stay with her. The terrible scene went on for another 15 minutes before the waters finally became still and there were no longer any signs of violent splashing. And only then did emergency services arrive. But their only job now was to fish what was left of Frederick out of the water and to get the traumatized Margit to the hospital. That young boy held onto her hand until the ambulance doors closed and he was left standing on the beach, watching the ambulance drive away. Another vehicle took Frederick's remains away. Besides his right arm, Frederick's entire lower body was gone, and most of the organs in his abdomen had spilled out too. You'd think that such a gruesome death would mean the end of swimming at Port St. John's. But no. Less than an hour later, the surf was full of people again, none of them even aware of the terrible attack that had just happened in the very waters that they were swimming in. And even now, 14 years later, there are still no lifeguards or boats patrolling the waters, just a handful of signs that stand crooked and rusting in place to warn swimmers of the danger beneath the waves, until someone else is inevitably taken by the gray monsters that lurk beneath the surface and meets their own terrifying final affliction. It was whale migration season off the coast of Western Australia. Drawn towards their migration route, great white sharks are known to head northwards to meet the returning whales. This is often when the whales are most dangerous, as the shark population swells and they prowl the coastlines in greater numbers. One of the things known about great white sharks, and that is they are solitary hunters. They don't hunt in packs, a behavior that has been documented in other shark species. But that was about to change as passionate surfer 29-year-old Bradley Smith entered the water on July 10, 2004. From Shoalwater, 41 kilometers west of Australian state capital Perth, Bradley and a group of friends paddled out into the Indian Ocean. They were surfing at Left-Handers Beach, south of Gracetown, near Margaret River. The beach is a popular spot and is considered safe for more junior surfers. Nobody could have predicted what happened that day. As Bradley and his friends lay on their boards, floating on the surface of the ocean, not one, but two great white sharks prowled below the waves. Cooperative hunting is not documented in great white sharks, but these two clearly had their eyes on the same prize, the silhouetted figures of the surfers above them. After swimming along the coastline, the two sharks began to swim up through the water column. They headed directly for the surfers and began to power towards the surface. Bradley's friends looked over to see the terrifying shadow of a great white shark. It was so enormous that they described it as wide as a car. It was the megalodon of modern times, and it was heading straight for Bradley. Before anybody could get out of the way, there was suddenly an eruption of water right beside Bradley, and he was thrown off his board. The shark that made the hit was estimated to be 4.5 meters, almost 15 feet long. But that's when the group of friends spotted a second shark. When Bradley hit the water, he knew what was coming. He knew he had been struck by a shark and desperately grappled to get back onto his board. But the sharks were in attack mode. As the smaller of the two, at 3 meters, 10 feet long, circled Bradley whilst he splashed in the water, the other came in for the kill. Its dark shadow torpedoed below the other surfers heading straight for Bradley. His friends could only look on in horror as the dorsal fin sliced through the surface moments before it opened its jaws just feet from where Bradley trod water. Seconds later, the shark grabbed him, and he was pulled under the surface. The sharp, serrated teeth dug into his flesh, holding him in a vice-like grip. But Bradley was an incredibly brave young man and refused to give up. He thrashed around in the shark's jaws, hitting it and kicking with his legs. Miraculously, he made it back up to the surface as the shark let go for a moment. But Bradley wasn't dealing with just one shark. He was dealing with two, and the blood that now poured from his open wounds incited the marine predators, and a feeding frenzy ensued. At that point, there was so much commotion in the water, so much splashing and bubbling and boiling, that it was impossible to tell which shark was attacking Bradley. It was a desperate fight for survival, and a devastating thing for his friends to witness. His mates, still on their surfboards just feet from where Bradley was being attacked, implored him to escape. With every fiber of their bodies, they willed him to make a break for it. "Swim for your life, mate," they shouted. "Swim for your life." That's exactly what Bradley was trying to do. But as each of the sharks came at him again and again, he couldn't fend them off. He kept punching them with his fists and pushing them away as their snouts broke through the surface right next to him. But it was a losing battle. One of his friends rushed to the shore and ran out of the water to call for help. He dialed 000 and turned to look back at the sea, shocked and shaken by what he had just witnessed. Seeing how enormous the sharks were and how intense their attack was, his friends knew Bradley was in the fight for his life. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. The two sharks had been on the hunt, and they had settled on Bradley as their prey. It was such a rapid and ferocious attack by two absolutely giant sharks that at one point, when one of the sharks opened its jaws to bite Bradley, an eyewitness described the jaws as wide as the length of a man's arm. The shark could have swallowed Bradley whole. With both great whites furiously biting, tugging, and pulling at the young man, his body was practically torn in two. After 45 seconds of relentless attacking, there was a break in the feeding frenzy, and Bradley's body floated on the surface, motionless. His friends seized their opportunity. With the two man-eaters just feet away, they frantically paddled over to Bradley, who was now surrounded in a dark cloud of red seawater. Bravely, his friends grabbed hold of him. He was no longer moving. He no longer had any fight left in him. He had bled out from the attack just yards from dry land, and only feet from some of his best friends. As the friends pulled Bradley towards the shoreline, he left a trail of blood behind them. It was tantalizing for the two sharks, and the short paddle to the beach felt like an eternity as the friends thought that they might be next. Not daring to look behind them, they focused on the shore and the safety of the beach. Finally, they made it to the shallows and dragged Bradley out of the water. With the friends too traumatized to describe Bradley's injuries, another eyewitness told media that Bradley had been torn in half. It's something that you may see in the movies, but you never for 1 second think that it is something that is going to happen to one of your best friends. Bradley's board was brought to shore afterwards. It had been completely snapped in half by the shark's razor-sharp teeth. The bite mark was testament to just how massive the great whites had been. Following the harrowing tragedy, marksmen in a flotilla of boats who were accompanied by a police helicopter scoured the ocean for the 2 man-eating giants. Normally, great white sharks are protected, and it is forbidden to hunt them. But fisheries officer Tony Capilouti said that if a shark poses a significant threat to humans and has attacked before, then officers are always authorized to kill it. As the search party headed out into the surf, there was no sign of the 2 sharks. They had likely been scared off by the sound of the engines and the commotion. But there was dispute amongst many Australians. As is often the case after an attack, the debate about whether or not to kill those responsible arose. Shark nets that are installed along some stretches of the Australian coast are not considered effective and pose significant risk to other marine life. Authorities worry that if a shark has tasted human blood, then they may be more likely to attack people again. But a few days after the attack, words of support for the 2 sharks were spoken by the most unlikely of people, Bradley's brother. He said that a revenge killing wasn't going to bring his brother back, and it's not what Bradley would have wanted. An uneasiness came over locals when a week passed and no sign of the 2 enormous sharks was found. They had vanished from the coastal waters, and with the ability to travel more than 100 miles a day, the search area was now huge. Marine experts were surprised by the behavior of the 2 sharks. Eyewitnesses reported one shark knocking Bradley off the board and the other coming in to attack him. It seemed like a collaborative hunt, something else that added to the uneasiness of the locals. But for most avid surfers, the terrible attack wasn't going to stop them going into the water. When the very same beach was reopened following the tragedy, surfers were back out in the waves. They knew the dangers, and their love for the sport far outweighed any fear they may have of being eaten by a shark and meeting their own final affliction. Therese and Ian Cartwright loved the ocean. Fishing, kayaking, and snorkeling were some of their favorite pastimes. They'd been doing one activity or another centered around the sea since they started dating in their early 20s, and it was a habit they kept up all throughout their marriage. After having their first baby, Therese took nearly a year off from water activities after their son was born, and her next pregnancy required an even longer hiatus from her beloved waves because Therese and Ian soon found out that they were going to be parents of quadruplets. With all those babies to carry, Therese couldn't even float in the shallows. She was just too heavy and uncomfortable to even try. And when the 4 new little Cartwrights finally arrived, well, keeping 4 busy babies occupied kept Therese out of the fun for 2 more years. The little Cartwrights were being raised to love the water just as much as their parents, and soon they were paddling the water with their arm floaties alongside their big brother, too. The family trip that took place in June of 1993, when Therese was 34 years old, was a little different, though. She hadn't gone snorkeling outside of short outings along the coastline every now and then, and she'd been itching to make a day of it for years now. While their eldest son decided to stay behind to visit his grandparents for the week, the rest of the Cartwrights went on a week-long holiday with 2 of Ian's work colleagues and another family friend along for the ride. They rented a motorized boat and decided to spend that first day on Barrenjoey Island, right off the coast of Tasmania, scuba diving in the midst of seal and sea lion colonies. The quads were 6 years old, so they were at least content to stay safely on the boat while the grown-ups took turns going into the water so that there was at least one adult with the children at all times. Everyone knew, even back in 1993, that diving amongst a pack of seals, as fun as it can also be incredibly dangerous. Seals and sea lions aren't much of a danger to humans. If anything, their underwater acrobatics and playful natures make them the perfect sea mammals to view up close for divers. It's the predators that are drawn to them. That's the problem. Sharks of all kinds follow colonies like moths to a flame. Hammerheads, tigers, and the fearsome great white can almost always be seen somewhere in the vicinity. Since the mammals are so numerous and they congregate in pockets where schools of fish are moving through, there's usually so much going on that the predators are much more likely to go for the seals, their natural prey, than they are to bother with the humans that swim and dive in shallow water where they can't hunt as comfortably. Unfortunately, a human in a dark wetsuit and a sea lion don't look that much different from one another from a distance. It just takes one unlucky human being in the wrong place at the wrong time for a predator to target the wrong species. Sure enough, the morning started out great. Ian took to the water first, where he and the other 3 men had a grand time snorkeling amongst the rocky underwater outcrops, and there were plenty of curious seals that made an appearance to observe the strange humans in their waters. Some of them came so close that the divers could have touched them if they wanted to. After 2 hours, just a little before 10 that morning, Ian and one of his colleagues got out of the water to relieve Therese, where she'd been setting out lunchboxes and toys for the quads so that they could keep themselves busy, but they weren't very interested in their toys. They made a game of watching the leaping sea lions hanging out by the railings, where Ian had to keep a hand close to their puffy little jackets in case they slipped and fell. The other 2 men were still in the water, weaving in and out, having their own little game to see who could collect the most mussels from the rocks beneath. Therese got in, strapped her goggles on, and spent the first few minutes floating topside with her face down, watching the darting animals in the 30-foot deep water below her. It was those few minutes that she took to acclimate to the water, which was the biggest mistake that Teresa could have made. The 15-foot great white shark that had been stalking in the background was waiting for just such a moment. Under the water, sea lions and seals were incredibly fast, so sharks don't bother targeting them as the mammals are hunting. It's when a seal floats on the surface of the water to take a moment to catch its breath and rest from expending all of its energy catching fish that they normally strike. To the predator, Therese looked just like any other seal. She was still for just long enough that it bolted out of the deep, gunning straight for Teresa's lazily floating figure. Therese just saw the 2 sea lions below her shoot off into the water without realizing that they were fleeing for their lives, and that this was not just another one of their aquatic games. With no warning and no sense of her doom streaking toward her, the shark snapped its jaws around the soft tissue of Teresa's waist. It came with such great speed that they were both catapulted out of the water, breaking the surface in an almost graceful arc, leaving a trail in the air of red spray and ribbons of torn intestines. When they struck the water at the end of their arc, the force was so great that the animal's teeth slammed right through Therese, taking most of her abdomen in one single swallow. Therese had a fleeting moment of terror, a jab of pain, and then it was all dark. She died almost instantly. Torn in half, the trauma to her body was just too great. In an instant, most of her internal organs were gone, swallowed up by the beast, and more than half of her body's blood was dumped out. Ian and the twins stared open-mouthed. It had happened so quickly that they hadn't comprehended what took place immediately. But then all hell broke loose. One of the children started to scream. Another clawed at his father, trying to launch his tiny little body into the current to save his mommy. Ian, screaming for help, could only try to hold on to his children, keeping them from jumping into the water themselves. His colleagues below were still preoccupied with their game. They hadn't even realized that there was literal murder happening above their heads. And his other colleague just stared, catatonic and completely dumbfounded at the horrific scene that played out before him. Teresa's legs were bobbing a few feet away from the boat, while her upper torso began to sink under the waves. The shark circled around and grabbed up Teresa's torso just as she was about to submerge completely. And also, at the same time that the divers from below surfaced, they saw the crimson water, the macabre sight of two legs floating beside them, and they even caught a glimpse of Teresa's brown hair poking out of the gigantic shark's mouth just before it disappeared again. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together after such a sight. Dropping their muscles, they made a dash for the boat, scrambling to get to safety. Each man grabbed one of the flailing children before Ian lost his grip on his hysterical babies and yelled for the third man to get the boat in gear and drive. The reality was clear. Therese was dead. They needed to get out before one of the children landed in the water themselves, and if they were quick enough to get to the authorities, there might be something of the mother of 5 left to bring back home. With one last look over their shoulders, they saw the 15-foot beast rear out of the water for a third time, this time going for the pair of legs that were still attached to the shattered hip bones. They didn't stick around long enough to see whether or not the shark had gotten all of Therese. As they headed towards safety, they radioed for the Coast Guard and met the search team on the beach. But authorities didn't have an easy job of locating the rest of Therese. Besides a single leg floating on the surface, there was no safe way to send divers down to look for anything else. It wasn't just that single shark out there that had eaten the young mother. There were other carnivores feeding on the sea lions and seals too, and the blood and carnage wafted into the deep ocean, drawing all sorts of sharks to the area. And when they saw a pack of orcas in the area, all attempts to look any further were abandoned. It was just too dangerous to even sail on the water now, let alone expect divers to go down. No, the Cartwrights had no choice but to live the rest of their lives with the trauma of seeing their wife, mother, and friend quite literally ripped in half in front of their very eyes. They will never forget the day they witnessed Therese's horrifying final affliction.